Hey guys, tonight we're going to sip on something that might just make you see history in a whole new light, tea. Now, I know what you're thinking, really? Tea? How could that possibly have anything to do with politics? Well, let me take you back to the 17th century, a time when a humble drink slowly but surely began to stir the pot in British society. By the time you're done with tonight's story, you'll never look at a cup of tea the same way again. Trust me on that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not leave me a comment below telling me what city you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always fun to know where in the world my sleepy friends are watching. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, London, 1660s. It's a time of great social change. The city is full of excitement, the streets echoing with the hustle and bustle of a recovering monarchy. Charles II has just returned to the throne after a brief period of living in exile, as you do when you're a king who had to flee. The monarchy is trying to re-establish itself after the chaos of the English Civil War, and there's one thing on everyone's mind. Well, two things: restoring order and making sure people have something to drink. Enter tea. Tea was not exactly an everyday drink in England. In fact, it was pretty much a foreign luxury imported from the faraway East, where it had been enjoyed for centuries. The Dutch had brought it into Europe, and it didn't take long for it to reach England. The first recorded mention of tea in Britain dates back to 1657, when a certain merchant named Thomas Garraway opened a coffee house in London and sold tea. But it wasn't really a thing yet, not like the kind of tea culture that would later explode across the world. No, back then, tea was considered an exotic and, frankly, expensive beverage, a commodity for the upper crust, the elites, and those who fancied themselves a little more sophisticated. You see, the thing about tea at the time was that it was ridiculously expensive. Only the wealthiest could afford to sip on the leaves of the Chinese plant, and because of that, it quickly became a symbol of social status. But that wasn't the only thing that made tea special in the political climate of the time. Tea was about to do something even bigger. It was going to shift the balance of power in England. I mean, who would have thought, right? A simple beverage like tea, transforming political landscapes in one of the world's most influential nations? But that's exactly what happened. Tea was more than just a drink. It was a signal that you were part of the aristocracy, part of the establishment. The more tea you drank, the more you were included in the changing social dynamics. So, now that we know tea was fancy, you may be wondering how on earth it's tied to the world of politics. Well, here's the twist. The British government loved their taxes. And what better to tax than something that everyone rich and powerful was drinking? Tea became a source of revenue, which is exactly what the crown needed after so much political upheaval. And here's the real kicker, that lovely cup of tea you just can't stop sipping? It became a way for the government to get their hands on your money. Taxes on tea became the talk of the town, and, of course, that meant things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. But before we get too deep into the role of tea in British politics, let's pause for a second. Because, while tea was steeping its way into the political elite's cups, the people who brewed it didn't always have it easy. There's a whole backstory here, one involving the people behind the scenes, the traders, the merchants, and the ones who brought tea from the distant shores of China and India. Those early merchants were pretty much the power players of their time, and they had their own unique struggles to face as they fought to get that sweet tea into the hands of the English. So, let's rewind just a bit. Imagine you're in the 17th century. You're a wealthy merchant in London, and you've just struck a deal with one of the major East India companies. That's right, the East India Company, which, by the way, wasn't just a company. It was a massive powerhouse, almost like a floating empire with its own army, fleets, and, most importantly, access to the kind of goods that could make or break you: spices, silk, and, of course, tea. Now, before you get too comfy, take a moment to picture what it was like to be a part of this emerging global network. You're living in a world where the rise of imperialism means that trade is everything. If you've got the right goods, the right connections, you're living the high life. But here's the catch: everything, and I mean everything, is about to get a lot more complicated. Back in the day, tea wasn't just about a warm, cozy cup to sip on while you chatted about the latest gossip. It was a business, and a lucrative one at that. The East India Company was the first to dominate this tea trade in Britain, and its hold on this valuable commodity gave them a huge advantage. But this was no ordinary business. The company's dealings with the British government were downright political. The tea trade became an essential part of the Crown's economic plans, which, as we'll see, led to some serious long-term consequences. So how did this all work? Well, for starters, there was a significant tax placed on goods coming into England. At first, it wasn't specifically on tea, but that would change soon enough. The East India Company enjoyed favorable treatment from the British monarchy, getting all kinds of privileges and support for their tea endeavors. In return, they helped generate significant revenue for the Crown. The royal family, and really anyone in power at the time, was pretty thrilled about the whole arrangement. But here's the thing: the East India Company didn't just sell tea, they sold influence. By providing the Crown with a steady income, they also gained political leverage. This led to a unique relationship where a company could not only influence the market, but also the policies of the government itself. Talk about a corporate empire! Now, this arrangement worked out just fine until it didn't. See, the issue started when the Crown began relying more and more on tea as a source of revenue. The government, in its infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, decided that what tea really needed was more taxes. So, they began taxing tea in a way that made the already expensive commodity even harder to afford. The idea was simple: tax the wealthy's indulgence, and you'll generate more revenue. But here's where it gets a little complicated. You see, the taxes didn't just target the rich. They also hit the common folk, who, though they may not have been able to buy expensive tea at first, found themselves wanting a taste of that high society life. And they weren't about to just sit there and take it. Oh no, tea drinkers, they decided to get creative. Tea became a political symbol in ways no one expected. You know how today people love to argue about politics over a cup of coffee? Well, in the 17th century, tea had that same sort of effect. But instead of Instagram posts or heated dinner table debates, people were protesting in the streets. Why? Because when taxes go up on a drink that has become part of your daily ritual, you start to notice. And when you're struggling to make ends meet, that cup of tea becomes more than just a drink. It's a symbol of the power, or lack thereof, that you hold. Now, you might be thinking, but tea wasn't just about taxes and politics. Surely there was more to it. You're absolutely right. Tea wasn't just a means to fuel protests or a political pawn. It had an even deeper influence on British society, which we'll explore next. And let me tell you, it's not just about who drinks the most tea or what the tax rate is. There's something else at play here, something that's going to change the way you think about your next cup of tea forever. All right, let's take a step back and appreciate just how deeply tea was woven into the fabric of British society. So far, we've covered how tea became a symbol of wealth and influence. But there's more to it. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was an entire experience, an occasion. You're about to find out how this little drink became central to one of the most iconic British traditions, afternoon tea. Imagine it's the early 18th century. The fashion of the day is extravagant: corsets, ruffles, powdered wigs, and lots of tea. But here's the kicker: while everyone's getting dressed up, there's one woman who's quietly changing the course of British history. Meet Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who became the wife of King Charles II. Now, you might think Catherine's contribution to Britain would be more in the realm of royal duties, maybe birthing heirs, attending court, or influencing politics behind the scenes. But no, her most lasting legacy? Her love of tea. You see, Catherine brought tea with her when she married Charles II in 1662, introducing it to the British court. And let me tell you, the British court was not ready for this. Imagine everyone in their grand gowns and powdered wigs. But instead of wine or ale, the Queen insists on having tea served in dainty porcelain cups. Now, You know how things go when something foreign hits British soil. They don't just like it, they obsess over it. Tea quickly went from being an exotic drink for the elites to a full-fledged fashion statement. And that, my friends, was the birth of afternoon tea, a tradition that continues to this day. But it wasn't just about sipping tea at 4 p.m. It was about showing who you were. If you had the money, you could afford the finest teas and the prettiest teapots. But it wasn't just about looking fancy. Tea time became a social event, an opportunity for the upper class to gossip, discuss the day's happenings, and, of course, subtly flaunt their status. But here's the funny part. When you look back at the tea time tradition, you realize it wasn't just the rich who were in on the action. Oh no, even the working class caught on, though their tea was likely a bit less posh. They couldn't always afford fine tea or the fancy cakes and sandwiches that went with it. But tea itself became an important part of their daily lives, too. The rituals surrounding it, the way it made you feel part of something bigger than yourself. That's what made tea so revolutionary. And here's the twist, even as tea became this highly fashionable, elite thing, it had this incredible power to bring people together. The lower classes, who had no access to the luxurious tea parlors of the wealthy, started brewing their own versions of the drink, often spiced with herbs or served in a more economical manner. This, my friend, was the beginning of the democratization of tea in Britain. Everyone, literally everyone, was drinking it. Now, what makes this all even more interesting is that this entire tea craze wasn't just about fashion or daily ritual. It was also about control. You see, the establishment loved that tea was a tool for social stratification. It allowed them to maintain this carefully constructed hierarchy, where the upper class could sip their fine tea and feel superior, while the working class brewed up their simpler versions, but still felt a sense of camaraderie. It was this delicate balance of inclusion and exclusion that made tea such a political tool. And it wasn't just the monarchy or the elites who were cashing in on tea. There was an entire industry built around it. Merchants, traders, and even colonial powers like the East India Company were benefiting from this explosion of tea culture. The more tea people drank, the more money flowed into the economy. In fact, it became a key part of Britain's international trade. And, as you might guess, international politics. The strange thing is, while all this tea drinking was happening, not everyone was happy about it. The government, which had already begun taxing tea heavily to pay for all sorts of things, now found themselves with a bit of a problem. See, when the price of tea went up, the demand didn't decrease. Oh no, it went up even more. And that's where the East India Company's monopoly started to cause some serious tension. Now, don't get too cozy with your tea just yet. This story isn't over, and it's about to get a whole lot spicier, because the very tea that's been bringing people together, it's also going to fuel some very serious conflicts. Now that you've got the picture of tea becoming not only a symbol of class, but a full-blown economic engine, let's turn the heat up a little. The time has come for us to talk about the real troublemaker in all this tea drama, taxes. Yes, taxes. The thing that gets every Brit's blood boiling, even to this day. Imagine this, it's the early 18th century, and the British government, having gotten comfortable with all that sweet revenue from the East India Company's tea trade, starts doing what governments do best, raise taxes. But it wasn't just any tax, oh no. The government decided to slap a hefty tax on imported tea, a tea tax. I mean, come on, you might as well have taxed the air people breathed. You can almost hear the protests brewing already. The rich could take it, after all. They had deep pockets and a taste for the finest leaves. But the common folk? The ones who'd come to rely on tea as part of their daily routine, even though their tea was of the cheaper variety? They weren't so thrilled. And that, my friend, is where things started to get really interesting. The thing about tea taxes wasn't just that they made tea even more expensive. No, it was that they set off a chain reaction. With the price of tea going up, people started to notice. In fact, the common folk were really not happy about it. You see, tea had become more than just a drink. It had become an identity. It was about class, yes, but it was also about daily life. A simple cup of tea was a small luxury in an otherwise hard life. And the government, in their infinite wisdom, was making that small luxury more and more difficult to afford. This is where the protests came in, and boy, were they colorful. The British public didn't just grumble in their homes. Oh no. They took to the streets, staging protests that were so effective, they started gaining international attention. The most famous of these protests, of course, was the Boston Tea Party. But we'll get to that juicy bit in a minute. The interesting thing here is that the British didn't just face angry colonists. They faced themselves. You know, people back in Britain were getting just as upset about the tea taxes as the colonists were. Not all British people were on board with the Crown's heavy-handed approach. It's fascinating, isn't it? Tea, this humble drink, was now the flashpoint for a rebellion that would rock the very foundation of the British Empire. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, let's focus on how the East India Company, with all its power and connections, started to feel the heat of these rising tensions. See, the company's influence was built on a delicate balance of trade, politics, and good old-fashioned capitalism. But when the tea tax got raised too high, they began to notice a dip in profits. And that, of course, wasn't something they could let slide. So, they did what any savvy company would do. They started cutting deals with the British government. They argued that they were struggling and needed more support. And just like that, the government gave them a pass, on the taxes, at least. They lowered the tea tax for the East India Company, making it easier for them to import tea and sell it cheaper. And while that sounds like good news for the company, it only made the situation worse for the common people. Because what did the East India Company do next? They flooded the market with cheap tea. Tea that was still taxed but now more affordable than ever before. They were able to sell it at a price that outpaced the smuggling operations. And here's where things got really heated. Suddenly, the legal tea market had a huge advantage over the illegal one. Smuggling, once the lifeblood of the tea trade, was now being squeezed out. And that's where the real drama kicked off. People who had once turned to smuggling to get their hands on tea began to get really mad. You see, for many of these smugglers, tea wasn't just about the tea, it was about rebellion. It was about resisting the establishment. The smuggling trade was one of the few ways the lower classes could stick it to the system. But now, with cheaper legal tea flooding the market, it was a blow to their pride and their pockets. At this point, we've got a full-blown tea war on our hands, with both sides, government and smugglers, fighting for control of the market. But even with all this turmoil, the East India Company was still sitting pretty, making money hand over fist. And, of course, the government was still benefiting from the taxes, even if they were reducing them for their corporate pals. The people, though, they were starting to wonder if it was worth the cost. And here's the kicker, this battle over tea was just the beginning of a much bigger struggle. You see, it wasn't just about tea anymore. It was about power, about who controlled what, and the British Empire, as it turns out, was on the edge of a very dangerous precipice. But let's slow down for a second and consider just how far this tea trade really reached. Because it wasn't just about Britain and her colonies. The ripples from the tea wars spread all across the globe, creating alliances, tensions, and conflicts that would shape the future of the empire in ways no one could have predicted. All right, grab your cup of tea, because things are about to get even more intense. Now that we've set the stage with taxes, smuggling, and political tension, we're going to zoom in on one of the most significant events in all this tea drama, the Boston Tea Party. You've probably heard of it. Heck, maybe you even learned about it in school, but let's really break it down. The year is 1773, and the East India Company is sitting on a mountain of tea, thanks to the British government's sweet deal. But there's a little problem, the American colonists. They've had enough of the tea tax, enough of the East India Company's monopoly, and most importantly, enough of being treated like second-class citizens. They've been protesting, smuggling tea, and generally making life miserable for the British government. But, let's face it, when they realize the government's not budging, things are about to take a turn. Cue the Boston Tea Party. Picture this, it's a cold December night in Boston, and a group of colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians. Because why not, board 3 British ships loaded with tea. Now, here's the part you might not know. They didn't just toss a few boxes of tea overboard like some sort of rowdy college prank. No. They threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor. That's about 92,000 pounds of tea, worth over $1 million in today's money. Think about that for a second. This wasn't just an act of protest. It was an economic strike that sent shockwaves through the British Empire. But what's even more interesting is how this moment has been framed throughout history. The Boston Tea Party is often seen as a heroic, noble act. The bold, freedom-loving colonists taking a stand against a tyrannical government. But there's a twist here. Some historians argue that it wasn't just about the tax on tea. It was also about the monopoly the East India Company had over the trade. By cutting off the smuggling operations and making tea cheaper, the company had effectively turned the tea market into a corporate monopoly. The colonists weren't just protesting a tax. They were protesting the very idea of an unchecked company dictating their daily lives. As the tea splashed into the harbor, the British government, not surprisingly, was livid. They saw this as a direct attack on their authority. And in retaliation, they passed the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, laws that closed the Boston harbor and took away many of the colonists' rights. It was an attempt to choke off any further rebellion, but all it did was pour fuel on the fire. The Boston Tea Party didn't just send a message to the British. It was a declaration that the colonies were ready for something bigger, something that would eventually lead to revolution. Now, you might be thinking, well, tea's been a pretty big deal in British politics, but this is getting seriously out of hand. And you're absolutely right. The Boston Tea Party was just the start. In the years that followed, tea would continue to play a significant role in the rising tensions between Britain and its colonies, and eventually, between Britain and the rest of the world. But there's one more twist to this tale before we move on from the Boston Tea Party. While it was a massive act of defiance, it was also a moment that cemented tea as a symbol of rebellion, an emblem of resistance to authority. And it wasn't just the colonists who saw it that way. Back in Britain, tea's place in society was being questioned too. The fact that such a simple thing, just a drink, could spark such chaos spoke volumes about the power of seemingly insignificant daily rituals. But the Boston Tea Party didn't just change the fate of the American colonies. It also marked a major turning point in the British Empire's view of tea. You see, tea had been a unifying force, a source of power for the British. But now, it was a double-edged sword, a source of division, a commodity that not only fueled political protest, but also threatened the very unity of the empire itself. And while the British government would eventually get its act together and put down the rebellion, at least for a time, tea continued to leave a lasting imprint on politics, both at home and abroad. The Boston Tea Party showed the world just how potent a cup of tea could be, how it could ignite revolutions, how it could change the course of nations. But as we shift away from colonial America and back to Britain, things are still brewing. The next chapter in the story of tea and politics isn't just about what happened next in the American Revolution. It's about how tea continued to evolve as a political tool, how it became a way for people to express their identity, and how it would continue to shape the future of British society for years to come. Now that we've seen the chaos the Boston Tea Party stirred up across the Atlantic, it's time to focus back on Britain itself, where tea continued to be the great political catalyst. You might think the fallout from the Boston Tea Party would have convinced the British monarchy to rethink its strategy, but no, tea was still very much at the heart of political maneuvering. In fact, in the years following the Boston Tea Party, tea would go on to play a key role in the transformation of British society itself. Let's rewind a little to Britain in the 18th century. By now, tea had firmly taken root in the culture, and its consumption was no longer reserved solely for the upper class. Tea was everywhere, and with that came a whole new set of social norms. Afternoon tea had evolved into an event not just for the wealthy, but for anyone who could afford a cup of the now more accessible commodity. As tea became a daily staple, it also became a symbol of Britishness, something that united people across the classes. Though with clear distinctions in quality, the working class may have had to settle for tea made from cheap leaves, but the experience was the same. Everyone had tea, and everyone had their own version of it. Here's where it gets interesting. The British establishment, ever the opportunist, saw the rise of tea consumption not just as a symbol of unity, but also as a tool for social control. You see, while tea had the power to bring people together, it also had the power to define who was in and who was out. The elaborate tea parties held by the upper class were a way of reinforcing social hierarchies. They were an opportunity to show off, to exclude the wrong sort of people, and to make sure the political elite stayed firmly in control. Tea had become more than just a beverage. It had become a way to reaffirm one's place in society. If you were drinking fine, exotic tea with your friends at an extravagant garden party, well, you were obviously one of the privileged few. If you were sipping a cheap brew at home, you were a part of the common folk. These distinctions were about more than just taste. They were about power, identity, and maintaining the class system. But not everyone was content with the role tea played in their lives. There were murmurs of discontent, especially among the lower classes, who saw the growing obsession with tea as a means of control. By elevating tea to the status of a social marker, the British establishment effectively made it something that could be used against them. The same people who had once smuggled tea to rebel against taxes were now being told they could only drink a certain kind of tea if they wanted to fit in. It's almost ironic, isn't it? Tea had gone from being a symbol of rebellion to something that reinforced the very system of oppression that the common folk had once fought against. But that's the thing about tea. It's a mirror. It reflects whatever society wants it to reflect. In 18th century Britain, it was used as a tool of both unity and division. The working class might have been drawn to tea as a means of everyday escape, but the British elite had their own version of escape. They turned tea into an art form, a social gathering, and even a political statement. In doing so, they ensured that tea remained an essential part of British life. You couldn't escape it, no matter how hard you tried. Now, before you get too lost in the politics of tea, let's pause for a second and take a step back. Think about the real power behind this drink. It wasn't just the taxes or the monopoly that made tea so important. It was the very fact that it had become something deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of Britain. Tea was everywhere, from the grandest royal court to the smallest of cottages. It had transcended its origins as a luxury good, and had become an essential part of British identity. And that's where tea's influence truly lies. It was a commodity that had the power to shape political discourse, define social structures, and even influence global trade. But, as we'll soon see, tea's power wasn't just limited to Britain. Its influence would soon spread to other parts of the world, changing history in ways no one could have foreseen. But we're not quite done yet, because as we follow tea's journey through time, we're going to see how it not only changed the political landscape in Britain, but also how it became a key player in the struggle for independence in other corners of the world. The ripple effects of the Boston Tea Party weren't limited to the American Revolution. No, tea would continue to be a key player in the struggles of colonized peoples everywhere, whether in India, China, or elsewhere, leading to a series of global revolutions that would forever alter the course of history. So, let's take a deep breath, sip that tea, and get ready for the next chapter in this tale of politics, power, and rebellion. The world is about to change, and tea will be right at the center of it all. All right, let's pick up the pace a little, because this tea journey is just getting more intriguing. Now that we've explored how tea became a symbol of political power and class in Britain, we need to zoom out a bit and look at how it began to influence the rest of the world, because, believe it or not, Britain wasn't the only place where tea was brewing trouble. One of the most significant ripple effects of the British tea trade was felt in India, which, by the 19th century, would become an epicenter of tea cultivation. But how did this happen? Well, it's actually a pretty fascinating tale of imperial ambition, corporate greed, and a good dose of historical irony. Let's rewind to the early 1800s. The British Empire had already carved up much of the world by this point, but they weren't satisfied with just controlling trade routes. No, they needed something bigger. They needed to produce their own tea. Why, you ask? Simple. The British Empire wanted to break the monopoly of the East India Company, which had been controlling the flow of tea from China. And what better way to do that than to grow tea on their own terms? So, the British set their sights on India, specifically on the fertile lands of Assam in the northeast, and began cultivating tea in large-scale plantations. It sounds simple enough, but here's the thing. Tea wasn't originally native to India. It was a foreign crop, and growing it on Indian soil took a lot of effort, experimentation, and, let's face it, a lot of exploitation. The British brought in skilled laborers from China, but they also relied on the forced labor of local Indian workers. These workers were treated terribly, working long hours under harsh conditions, and often paid in little more than rice and tea itself. It wasn't a pretty sight, but it was profitable. The British Empire saw India as a perfect place to cultivate tea at a massive scale, and that's exactly what they did. The irony of it all? While the British were drinking tea by the gallon, the Indian laborers who grew it often couldn't afford a single cup. Tea, which was once the drink of the rich and powerful in Britain, had now become a symbol of oppression in the colonies. It's a striking example of how the global tea trade wasn't just a product of good business. It was also the result of ruthless exploitation. But this isn't just a sad story of colonialism. No, there's a twist to this tale. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Indian tea trade became one of the key elements in the British economy. It wasn't just about the British drinking tea anymore. It was about global commerce. Tea became a major export, and India became a primary supplier for the world's tea consumption. What started as a colonial venture had turned into a global business empire. Now, tea's influence was expanding far beyond the British Isles. It was shaping economies, cultures, and trade networks around the world. India, China, and later Africa became part of the tea-drinking world. But the legacy of the British Empire's tea monopoly wasn't just about economics. It also paved the way for future struggles for independence in India, as the very same tea plantations that had fueled the British economy would become a rallying point for anti-colonial sentiment. As India's tea production soared, so did its nationalist movements. The workers who labored in the plantations, often under brutal conditions, began to demand better pay and working conditions. The symbolism of tea would soon become something more. It would be about freedom, about shaking off the shackles of colonialism. And it wasn't just in India where this story played out. Tea's influence didn't stop at the British colonies. No, this story spans continents. In China, for example, tea had been grown for centuries. But with the rise of British trade, Chinese tea was suddenly seen as a commodity to be controlled and manipulated by the West. The British East India Company's monopoly on the tea trade in China led to a series of political and economic conflicts, most notably the Opium Wars in the mid-1800s. The British wanted more and more tea, but the Chinese didn't want to trade with them, so they tried to balance the trade with opium. As you can imagine, this led to a major international crisis. The Opium Wars are one of the darkest chapters in the history of tea, as they were driven by the West's insatiable demand for Chinese goods, especially tea. The wars resulted in the forced opening of Chinese markets to British trade, forever altering China's economic and political landscape. In a twisted way, tea was at the heart of this international conflict, a symbol of how something as simple as a drink could fuel global power struggles. By now, tea had truly become a global commodity, intertwined with colonial ambitions, economic interests, and political power. The ripples from the British tea trade spread all across Asia and beyond. But there was one more region where tea's influence would be felt: Africa. As European powers expanded their reach into Africa, they brought with them their love for tea and the desire to control its production. Tea plantations began popping up in countries like Kenya and Tanzania. The story of Africa and tea was yet another chapter in the legacy of the British Empire, but it also marked the beginning of another round of exploitation, with African workers once again on the bottom rung of the economic ladder. So, what does all this have to do with the tea you drink today? Well, quite a lot. Actually, the story of tea is far from over, but what we've learned so far is that tea is more than just a drink. It's a symbol, a commodity, and an agent of political and economic change. From the Boston Tea Party to the tea plantations of India, tea has been a player in shaping the world's history. Whether it was fueling revolutions, sustaining empires, or causing international conflicts. And while we're sipping our tea today, enjoying its rich history, it's worth remembering that this humble beverage has been at the center of some of the most significant moments in history. So the next time you take a sip, think about all the hands it's passed through, both literally and figuratively, and how it's helped shape the world we live in today. You might think by now that tea's long and winding journey has come to an end, but in truth, we're only scratching the surface. From the British Empire's thirst for power to the tea plantations in India and Africa, tea has left a trail of history everywhere it's been. But here's the thing that might surprise you. As much as tea became a symbol of colonial control and political struggle, it also played a quiet role in the shaping of something else entirely: global trade. In the early days of tea trade, it was all about the European desire to own the East. Tea was something the British and other Europeans wanted to monopolize. But as the 19th century dawned, tea started to take on new significance, not just in terms of wealth, but as a global currency. In fact, tea became one of the most important products to fuel international trade routes. Think of it this way: tea was more than just a beverage to drink with your scones. It was a commodity that shifted power. And the real twist here? The global tea trade started to evolve in a way that made it impervious to the usual colonial tactics. While European powers had dominated tea production in their colonies, they soon realized something interesting. Tea was no longer just about taking over other people's lands. It had become so ingrained in global commerce that the people consuming it, and the countries where it was grown, started taking ownership of it in ways they hadn't before. Take Japan, for example. The Japanese had long been cultivating tea for centuries, but by the late 19th century, they'd become one of the most important players in the global tea market. Unlike other colonial nations, Japan didn't just passively take part in the trade. Instead, they began innovating new ways of growing tea, refining it, and marketing it. Japan turned tea into a symbol of quality, something special, something worth appreciating, and their method of cultivation and tea drinking rituals became something of a global trend. Ever had a cup of matcha? That's part of Japan's quiet takeover of the tea world. And then there's China. While China's role in the global tea trade had been complex, it's undeniable that the Chinese had an ancient mastery over tea production. The British may have tried to take control, but the Chinese had tea long before the West knew what it was. By the 19th and 20th centuries, China was still one of the largest producers of tea in the world, and the country continued to influence the global tea market, though not without a series of internal challenges, especially in the wake of the Opium Wars. But here's where things get fascinating. By the 20th century, tea production was no longer just controlled by European imperial powers or their former colonies. Global tea trade had diversified in a way that made it a truly international affair. The world was consuming more tea than ever, and new players like Sri Lanka, Taiwan, and even Kenya became major tea producers. The world was suddenly sharing a cup of tea, and this wasn't just about global trade. It was about connecting cultures, ideas, and, yes, even identities. In Kenya, for example, tea had been introduced by the British in the early 1900s, and over the next century, the Kenyan tea industry boomed. But while the British may have been the catalyst for the initial growth, the country itself took ownership of the tea industry and turned it into one of the largest tea producers in the world. Today, Kenya is among the top producers, exporting millions of tons of tea annually. The beauty of this story? Tea had gone from being a symbol of oppression to one of global connection, from the very thing that fueled imperial dominance to the cornerstone of a diverse, international industry. Yet even as tea expanded across continents and reshaped the global economy, the drink's roots in political struggle never fully disappeared. Tea's history is still tied to colonialism, to rebellion, and to the desire for control. But at the same time, it is also a story of adaptation and resistance. Tea became something that was no longer just defined by the powers that controlled it. Tea, over time, became an equalizer. And here's a kicker for you: despite all the struggles, tea remains today a drink of quiet rebellion. Sure, you'll still find corporate tea giants trying to control the market, but in many corners of the world, tea is something local, something personal. In China, India, Sri Lanka, and beyond, people still celebrate the humble tea leaf, and it's part of local identity. What was once a tool of empire, a symbol of wealth and political influence, has now become a global cultural marker that transcends borders. We've come a long way since Catherine of Braganza introduced tea to the British court. From her porcelain teacups to the streets of Boston, from the plantations of Assam to the tea fields of Kenya, tea has always been there, quietly shaping the course of history. It's a drink that brought the world together, fought against the empire, and even helped create new nations. But it's not just the tea itself that makes this story so captivating. It's the people, the stories, and the struggles that have flavored this beverage over the centuries. So, as you sip your cup of tea tonight, remember that this little leaf has been at the heart of some of the most transformative events in world history. From revolution to trade, from empire to independence, tea has been there every step of the way. And in a world where we're constantly told we need more possessions, more status, more stuff, perhaps there's something beautifully simple and humbling about tea. After all, it's been with us through thick and thin, through political upheavals, social revolutions, and everything in between. If a single drink can change the course of history, who knows what else is possible? By now, you might be wondering if the tea saga could get any more complicated, but trust me, there's still a little more to unpack. After all, the humble tea leaf didn't just end with the British Empire's control or the struggles for independence. It has continued to shape the political, social, and cultural landscape of the world. Even today, tea remains a silent force of influence. So, let's pivot slightly and take a look at how tea fits into the modern political landscape. You might be sipping your tea, relaxing, and thinking, this is a peaceful beverage, surely there's no drama left. But the tea industry today still carries echoes of its colonial past, and it's still a battleground for global influence. Take the modern-day tea industry, for example. Tea is big business, and a small handful of multinational corporations control much of the market. You may be enjoying a cup of Earl Grey or a fresh blend of green tea, but the story behind that cup is still tied to global trade, labor practices, and yes, politics. Tea production hasn't been entirely liberated from the shadows of colonialism. For one, let's talk about labor. While tea production has shifted away from colonial plantations, many of the workers on modern-day tea estates still live in harsh conditions. In places like India, Sri Lanka, and even Kenya, workers in tea fields often face low wages, poor working conditions, and limited access to healthcare or education. The tea industry remains a source of significant income for millions of people, but it's also one of the most challenging industries for fair labor practices. But it's not just about labor. Modern tea production is deeply intertwined with issues of environmental sustainability. The quest for mass production has led to widespread deforestation, pesticide use, and water shortages in tea-growing regions. While some countries have made strides in creating more sustainable practices, the tea industry, much like the global economy itself, is still grappling with balancing profits with responsibility. It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? A product that has been at the heart of rebellion and revolution is still facing modern-day struggles. And let's not forget the tea-drinking habits of the new global superpowers, especially China. While it's hard to say exactly when it happened, there's no doubt that China's re-emergence as an economic giant has had a profound effect on the global tea market. China is no longer just the origin of tea, it's now one of the largest producers, exporters, and consumers of tea in the world. But the shift goes deeper than just business. In China, tea is far more than a beverage, it's a part of the country's cultural fabric. It has roots that go back thousands of years. It represents philosophy, tradition, and identity. In fact, tea ceremonies, ancient tea cultures, and even the delicate art of tea tasting are still preserved and celebrated across the country. So, in some ways, tea is at the center of an identity struggle in China itself, where modernity meets ancient tradition. And here's where things get even more interesting. As China becomes more and more influential, it's also reviving its ancient tea culture as a form of soft power. China has realized that tea is more than just a drink, it's a tool of diplomacy. By exporting not only tea but its tea culture, China is able to create cultural ties with countries across Asia, Africa, and even Europe. It's like a modern-day version of what the British Empire did centuries ago, but this time, it's with a focus on cultural influence instead of economic dominance. But even as tea continues to be a tool of diplomacy and international trade, it also has a quietly subversive role in contemporary politics. Tea remains a beverage of protest, just as it was during the Boston Tea Party. Think about it, across the globe, protests have often been fueled by the same sentiments that fueled tea protests long ago: oppression, taxation, and power struggles. Take For example, the tea protests in Thailand in the early 2000s, where tea was used as a symbol to challenge political corruption and the economic elite. Even today, in countries like India and Sri Lanka, tea estates have become focal points for workers' rights and labor movements. The tea industry isn't just a business anymore, it's a political battleground. From labor rights to environmental sustainability, from global trade to cultural diplomacy, tea remains one of the most powerful and often overlooked agents of change in the modern world. But let's take a step back and reflect. After everything we've explored together, centuries of tea-related drama, rebellions, revolutions, corporate takeovers, and global power shifts, what does it all really mean? Is tea still relevant in the 21st century? Or has it simply become a quaint relic of a bygone era? Here's the thing, tea isn't just relevant, it's still evolving. And while the global stage is far different from what it was in the 17th or 18th century, tea continues to be a force of change. It's a symbol of continuity, a drink that has endured through centuries of chaos and conflict. Today, tea isn't just about the past, it's a part of the future. So, whether it's served at a royal court, in a workers' protest, or in a cozy cafe in Shanghai, tea's ability to spark change hasn't diminished. It's still there, quietly shaping our world in ways both big and small. The next time you sip your cup of tea, know that you're part of a long history, one that spans centuries, continents, and cultures, and that tea still holds the power to change the world, one cup at a time. Well, here we are, our final chapter in this long and fascinating journey through the history of tea. By now, you've seen how tea was the catalyst for revolutions, political struggles, and empire building. We've explored how tea became a symbol of both oppression and rebellion, a drink of the elite and of the masses, and even a commodity that shaped global trade. You might be thinking, what more is there to say about a cup of leaves and hot water? Well, let me tell you, there's always more to discover, especially when we look at tea's enduring legacy. At the heart of it all, tea is more than just a beverage, it's a cultural touchstone. It's been a steady presence in the world for centuries, quietly influencing the course of history. Whether we're talking about the fight for independence, the rise of colonial empires, or the political dramas that unfolded in the 20th century. And as we enter the 21st century, tea remains a defining element in many parts of the world, though now it's perhaps more important than ever. Let's think about where tea sits today in the global landscape. It's no longer the stuff of empire or revolution, it's the beverage of a connected, globalized world. While tea still carries echoes of its colonial past, it has also become a drink of modern innovation. Today, we have a tea culture that's as diverse as the countries that drink it. From bubble tea in Taiwan to green tea ceremonies in Japan, from chai in India to Earl Grey in England, tea has been reinterpreted and adapted in ways that reflect the tastes, values, and identities of countless cultures. But tea's importance today isn't just about culture, it's about wellness. Over the past few decades, tea has experienced something of a renaissance. People have rediscovered the drink not just for its comforting qualities, but for its health benefits. Green tea, with its antioxidants and supposed ability to improve metabolism, has become the go-to drink for those seeking a healthier lifestyle. Herbal teas, like chamomile or mint, are used for relaxation and stress relief. Tea has, once again, become a symbol of self-care and mindfulness. And yet, there's still more to tea's story. Despite the advancements in our global tea culture, some things haven't changed at all. The power of tea as a social connector has remained constant. Tea, like it has for centuries, brings people together, whether it's a casual gathering of friends, a formal business meeting, or an intimate family moment. It's a universal language of hospitality, warmth, and comfort, but tea still carries with it the lessons of the past. It's important to remember that its global success is tied to complex histories of colonization, exploitation, and political upheaval. Even as we enjoy our modern-day cup of tea, we should recognize that the labor of people in countries like India, Sri Lanka, and Kenya continues to power the global industry. As consumers, we must remember that the true cost of tea is more than just the price on the tag. It's the responsibility of each of us to support fair trade practices and ensure that the people who produce our tea are treated with dignity and respect. And, while we're on the topic of fair trade, let's not forget the importance of environmental sustainability. Tea cultivation has a significant impact on the environment. Deforestation, overuse of water resources, and pesticide use are all problems that continue to plague the industry. But there is hope. As awareness grows about the environmental costs of tea production, more companies and producers are focusing on sustainable farming practices. It's a reminder that even something as old and entrenched as tea can evolve, adapt, and find new ways to contribute to a better world. Now, let's take a moment and think about the cultural significance of tea in today's world. Tea is still a drink of ritual, of family, of pause. Whether you're sipping it on a rainy day in London, enjoying a warm cup of chai in Delhi, or participating in an elaborate Japanese tea ceremony, tea is an expression of time. It slows things down, gives you a moment to breathe, and encourages you to reflect on what's around you. In a world that's moving faster than ever before, there's something profoundly calming about a warm cup of tea. In a sense, tea is timeless. It's a thread that runs through the history of humanity, one that connects us across time and space. It's something simple, yet incredibly profound. From the first leaves picked in China to the Boston Tea Party, from the colonial plantations in India to the modern-day innovations in tea culture, tea continues to serve as a mirror of society, a drink that reflects our values, struggles, and triumphs. So, as we finish this journey through the world of tea, take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with this humble beverage. Whether you drink it for comfort, for health, or as part of your daily routine, tea is a part of your life in ways you may not even realize. And as it continues to shape our world, one cup at a time, we're all part of its story. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip through the history of tea. From rebellion to revolution, from colonialism to globalization, tea has been there, silently influencing the course of history. And as you sip your tea tonight, think about how this simple drink has been a companion through centuries of change. Maybe you'll look at that cup a little differently next time. Now, as the day winds down and you settle into the quiet, I'll leave you with a thought. Tea is more than just a drink. It's a symbol of our collective history, our shared struggles, and our continued journey toward a better world. And just like the story of tea, there's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to savor.